One of the first questions I get from students reading Byron is this: why was England's most famous poet known by over half a dozen different names? Well, I'll tell you the story of his names in just a minute, but think first about how odd it must have been to have had several names across a relatively short life. If our name is synonymous with our reputation, then to have several names automatically suggests a history of being unaccountable. Byron was every bit as mysterious and unpredictable as his many names suggest. He had no single identity, and yet he became the most famous of the Romantic poets. He cultivated his persona. He was a sex symbol, a rock star, and a god. The man we now know as Lord Byron was born and christened George Gordon Byron. But his father soon changed his name, taking his wife's last name in order to inherit her estate. His father became John Byron Gordon, and George became George Byron Gordon. At age 10, George inherited his own estate from the Byron side and became Lord Byron, giving up the Gordon. In a strange twist later in life, Byron's mother-in-law left him half of her estate, but her will required that he change his name to match the family surname Noel. Of course he did it for the money, and after that point became known as Noel Byron, and sometimes as Lord Noel Byron, and even sometimes as George Gordon Noel Byron. What he was called, or what he called himself at any given time, is sort of irrelevant. But the constant name changing does suggest that this was a person with a fragmented identity. Think about changing your name 4 or 5 times across your short 36-year lifespan. Name changes are sometimes deliberate. Think about some friend you knew from high school who always went by the name David, until one day everyone started calling him Dave. Or, for a more severe example, how about the kid who suddenly goes by his middle name arriving at college? It's even stranger when his middle name is actually his mother's maiden name. Now, changing your name provides an opportunity to reinvent yourself, and that's something that undoubtedly goes along with Byron's persona. And it's easy to see why Byron may have wanted to cover up the past and reinvent himself repeatedly. Byron's grandfather was the Vice Admiral John Byron, whose leadership in the westward expansion of the British colonies and imperialist aims were nothing like Byron's extremely liberal politics. The Vice Admiral's son, Byron's father, was a drunk and a crook. He deserted Byron's mother after taking her money to pay off his debts. From a young age, Byron had a fascination with the biblical story of Cain and Abel. He writes about this in his early letters and journals. He identified most with Cain, the murderous brother. In his preteen years, Byron was molested and beaten by his nanny, a trauma from which he likely never recovered. Byron's adolescence was tortured. His letters and journals tell us that he was either uncertain or ashamed of his sexuality, developing crushes on men, women, relatives, and friends. But Byron's interests were often requited. He was stunningly beautiful, a remarkably handsome man, a highly sexual person, and a sexually active person from a very young age. There was very little tolerance for bisexuality or homosexuality. It was, in fact, punishable by death. And so Byron's editors, publishers, and biographers worked to suppress this part of his identity. For Byron, image was everything. It's ironic, then, that this man of charming ways, stunning good looks, and a larger-than-life persona was also physically deformed. Byron, the hypersexual poet, was born with a club foot, and he walked with a great amount of pain on that foot and with a substantial limp. Here you see a portrait of Byron on his deathbed, but notice how his right foot is covered by a sheet. Byron compensated for his lack of ability to exercise on 2 feet by becoming an outstanding swimmer. In 1810, Byron swam from Sestos in Greece to Abydos in Turkey, crossing the Hellespont Strait from Europe to Asia. There's a common pattern of overcompensation in Byron's biography. He was a cripple, but he was a world-renowned swimmer. His sexuality was ambiguous, but instead of hiding it, he flaunted it. The theme of masking Byron's identity and refashioning his larger-than-life persona persisted throughout his career. Here's what's probably the most famous painting of Byron. He's sporting some fine Albanian garb. In 1816, possibly fleeing persecution for his homosexual tendencies, Byron left England forever. He settled at first in Switzerland, where he became close friends with Percy and Mary Shelley, and then lived and traveled in Italy and Greece. These were the years during which he wrote some of his most substantial and eventually famous poetry. Byron's premature death at the age of 36 was the result of a series of unfortunate events. In December of 1823, Byron joined the Greek military. In what would be Byron's most outlandish and riskiest move yet, Byron took up the quest for Greek independence as his personal mission. He joined the military, spent a small fortune on refitting their boats, and he led Greece to war, fighting Turkey for independence. In the next few months, he fell sick. There are many things about the circumstances that led to Byron's death that are tragic. Here was this crippled, pasty white Englishman who, cast out from England, found a home in Greece and then a cause so passionate that he went to war for them. The moral of the story is untrained soldiers should not go to war. He was susceptible to the changes in climate, and living in and amongst soldiers, as one does at war, Byron caught a bad cold. His cold became a worse cold, and then an infection, and doctors prescribed bloodletting, which made it worse. He eventually just died, and there went one of the greatest writers of English literature.